It's really good to welcome everybody, and we will be interested to know how you heard about tonight's event. If you're able to let us know by email afterwards or in the chat box, it's just good to know how our marketing has worked. But it's really good that we're all here from different parts of the country, and we're looking forward to participating earwigging in this conversation between Maggie and Diane. And Diane, I'm sure, will tell us about the book of poetry that she's just recently published, which is why we're gathering. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maggie and Diane. And what you might like to do in the top right in your view box, if you click speaker view, that means that you'll be able to see a close-up on your screen of whichever one is speaking, Diane or Maggie. So, Maggie, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And good evening to everybody. How lovely to see you all. Those I know and those I don't. And also good evening to Diane. And thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to us tonight, Diane, about your poems and about the residency. Publication of the book was delayed slightly by the pandemic, but now here we are, rah. So Diane, you've been a friend of Bradford Cathedral for quite a number of years. Could you tell us first how this residency came about?
Well, interestingly, it was through art exhibitions, because my husband, Antonio Pacitti, was an artist, and I showed his work in an exhibition called Journey with the Oppressed in the Cathedral. It included images of Guantanamo and the Iraq War, which he felt very strongly about. And my poems were used in Holy Week services. And then in 2018, there was another exhibition of ceramics. Out of that came a lovely booklet, Pots and Poetry. And just as we were setting up the exhibition, Canon Paul came and asked if I would consider writing some poems for this cathedral centenary. Now, I think you had in mind about 15 poems, but I'm afraid once I'm given a wonderful subject like Bradford, there's no stopping me.
Well, we were very glad that you agreed to be our poet in residence, which seems to me a highly daunting task. How did you prepare to write the poems?
Well, obviously talking to people. I had a long conversation with the Dean. I spoke to groups like the wonderful Stitchers group, who, as they sewed the long kneeler, were being stitched together in friendship. I love history, so I researched. To give one example, I contacted Bradford Archives to see if I could get a copy of the local paper the day that Bradford was granted cathedral status. And of course I walked. I walked the city, I walked the wonderful dales, which are such a presence around Bradford. And I wasn't just looking for the big public stories which are there in the buildings. I was looking for the hidden stories. And I'm going to give you an example. We took a long time finding this particular building. I knew it had been made into a hotel. I didn't realise it wasn't that anymore, so we kept overshooting. But in the end, we found this. Deserted steps which lead to an architrave door in Parkfield Road once bore the tired feet of journey days children, just arrived from the kinder transport. Soon the sparse contents of tiny suitcases were spilt on beds. Manila tags with identifying numbers were thrown away at last. That night, each child relived their last glimpse of parents waving from the long platform, faces stretched to a smile, and gripped that image with a tenacity that might well have to last a lifetime.
Thank you. Why, after the key poem Sighting, do you start the collection with the making of the Yorkshire landscape?
Well, I think we're also enclosed in our own houses or streets or towns. We often don't think about the huge cosmic and geological processes needed before ever there would be any human being. And when we begin to think about these processes, we realize our own tininess as human beings. And that's very important, given the way we have overreached our role in creation and we have destroyed and dominated. But also, paradoxically, yes, we feel tiny, but we are enlarged by the wonder and the awe that we feel. And that's a deeply religious experience. This poem is called Genesis Broad Ford. Before one brick of this city could be laid, continents had to clash and be remade. In the beginning was no mind of man, no human time scale, but a God span of transformation. Age on age must plane and gouge a landscape constantly made again. Half-mile high, a glacial sheet must press the rocks and shape them under ice stress. Now let us watch as tropical ferns are crushed in a black layer, which is slowly pushed to stretch out in a darkly sleeping scene under rock covers, holding in its stream the exploding heat of industry, the fire which will fuel mills, will flare out in empire. Humans, whose ground was once an ocean bed, make houses of sea creatures long dead. Pushed and piled by water, grains of sand weld in a building stone which seams the land, and bold Victorian constructs slice the sky. Long, long before this, the Himalaya-high mountains of Scotland shrink, bit after bit swept down, to reach the dales as millstone grit. And when the ice melts torrented and bored, it sculpted valleys, smoothed a river ford, a broad ford in one particular dale, which gave a name to this city, and my tale which has to flow like water, and take heed of sleeping fires, and chronicle human need, and which, like its cathedral, must embrace all that is broken in one sheltering place. This and the previous poem introduce the theme of rock and water, which runs through the collection, and it feels very biblical and also very Yorkshire.
You seem to have always had a plan for the collection, Diane. Can you tell us what that plan is and how it developed in your mind?
Well, the first Genesis poems, the making of the landscape, they end with my version of the fall, which is the terrible shock of the Norman conquest, when what we have seen in the previous poems as river or flower is suddenly laid waste in revenge. And land is just seen in terms of ownership and monetary value. There's that chilling line in the Doomsday Book, Ilbert hath it, it is waste. And of course we will return to the possession of land and imperialism later. After that, there's some poems about beginnings, like Christmas poems. And then quite early, there's that key poem about Bradford, A Divided Place, question mark, firmly question mark. in which I look at significant moments of Bradford's history, including the English Civil War, but right through to much recent events, relatively, like the riots. And the sequence shows that however dark, however conflicted, there's always a second story. There's always an emergence of hope. And then after that, I intersperse poems about the cathedral, the people associated with the city's history. There's a cluster of poems around Holy Week. And next to that, I put a poem about the German pastor, theologian, and martyr, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who travelled to Bradford to the German church. And out of that came the Bradford Declaration, which was a challenge to the Reich Church of Hitler. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was finally executed in a concentration camp. So it seems quite appropriate to have his story alongside the Passion of Christ. Towards the end, there's some quite contemplative poems, and then I deal with the centenary. Can I just say, I've mentioned rock and water. There's also running through the collection, there's a motif of silver. It's in an early poem when I imagine Bradford, long before any human beings near it, being an oasis of silver in the moonlight. And I picked it up from Polly Maynell's wonderful textiles. One of them's on the book cover, because she uses huge sweeps of white silver to suggest a redemptive force against the dark verticals in her textiles. And within my poems, the silver stands for the flow of water, the action of the Holy Spirit, and there's a constant theme of transformation.
Yes, 15 poems was never going to be enough, was it?
It was that.
And you suggested the title, Dark Angelic Mills, with some trepidation, I think. But we all realised immediately that it was a brilliant idea, and so did Canterbury Press. What was the inspiration for it?
Well, of course, if anyone mentions William Blake, a kind of wild gleam comes into my eyes, and I don't come up with anything anyone else will think is sensible. Of course, I'm referring to the dark satanic mills amongst which Jerusalem is built. And it fits Bradford, which of course has mills, an industrial past, and has known darkness, has known a great deal of hardship. But it was always going to be angelic and not satanic for Bradford, because it's a city of faiths. It's a city with a burning passion for social justice, as I show in some of my poems. It's a city of refuge, a place of neighbourliness. A nice thing writing about angels is that they're common to many religions, and that people who claim not to have any creed are often moved by the idea of angels. And in the very last poem of the collection, Angels of Bradford, which is my blessing on the cathedral and the city, I refer to the mysterious strangers who visit Abraham, who of course is a great figure in free faiths. If there are any angels who might visit Bradford, it would be the three, almost off duty, who dropped in on Abraham as humans and were fed. Now they would come in the guise of Kinder Transport children, Asian workers, Syrian refugees, Rohingya Muslims, and find a welcome and each offer back their own particular blessing.
Thank you. And so how does the cathedral fit with both the notion and the title of Dark Angelic Mills?
Oh, well, of course, the cathedral has known darkness because the cathedral holds the city. It holds the grief of the city, whether it's in a memorial window for men who suffered in the First World War, or whether it's in the very private grief of a memorial for a dead child. And the cathedral, like the city, has known a loss of its former role, which is always difficult, and has had to rethink its role. And I think we said we'd talk about that a bit later when we talk about the centenary. I'll just quote from Rowan Williams's introduction. This sentence is from his foreword is on the cover of the book. We are reminded of the luminous perspective that faith still manages to bring to the world of work and stress and conflict and coexistence. And you see that luminous perspective at work in the cathedral. It's a gathering place for the city. It's a place where vulnerable people are offered sandwiches and companionship. It provokes people to think with events and wonderful art exhibitions. And for me, very importantly, it holds a rhythm of prayer. A church on this site has held Bradford in whatever form it took, and the world in its prayer since Saxon times. I'd like to quote from the poem Coral Evensong, because Coral Evensong fascinates people who perhaps haven't got an explicit faith. It's actually the longest running outside radio broadcast in the world. It dates back to 1926, which shows how it fascinates people. And I think that's to do with that paradox of darkness and light. There's a first poem when I talk about the schoolboys who make up parts of the choir, and they're loud, boisterous boys erupting from school, thumping on the piano, eating sandwiches, perhaps struggling a bit in rehearsal. But while that's happening, the dark is building up outside, dissolving the darkness of the stained glass. The choir boys actually walk through a January storm in the dark. And in the service, in the act of confession, when we admit the dark of human failure, it's not just our own failure, but all the horrific acts of human history. And yet it's only this way can we enter Mary's song, which grows out of a seed of light, planted deep in the dark of a woman's body, planted in the night of Roman rule. And the shell of the nave is bodied with sound, as if it existed only to be a vessel overflowing with light made audible, as if its emptiness existed only to become a womb of swelling sound, of a radiance translated into sung word, and the silence that defines it. Early in the poem, I reflect that it's an extraordinary thing that we as human beings can sing in the midst of darkness. I end this poem even more miraculous. Some of us strive to perfect this singing so that every phrase seems to live on in the heart of the dark into which it disappears.
And many of us will recognise that.
Yes.
You've said that you want your poems to make readers see their city and the cathedral in a different way. Could you give us some examples of that?
Yes, I mean, if a visitor sees the venerable stone tower of the cathedral, they might not imagine it being hung frantically with wool sacks, as it was during the 17th century Civil War, to protect it from cannons, and it actually bears the marks of cannonballs. A shopper now in Darley Street might be surprised to hear that the shops were so grand once that it was claimed there were more Rolls Royces there than in London's Bond Street. And of course, young Bradford citizens wouldn't realise as they passed that huge domed building at the city centre that isn't used at the moment, they might not think that that holds the youth and the dreams of generations that it housed. It was a picture palace. It housed a Beatles concert, and it was a dance floor. But of course, if you're a poet, the real challenge is to take something that people think they know and make them look at it in a different way. One instance, I mean, the figure of Jesus is just so compelling that he has been written about, of course, endlessly through the centuries. But I suddenly thought, Jesus was a northerner. He came from the unfashionable north. And then a whole poem wrote itself. Or if we're talking about Saltaire, and I do write a poem about Sir Titus Salt, but you know, you can write about housing and mills, but how interesting to tell the history of Saltaire through colours. Who would have thought that wool white, which laboured for so long in drab worsted, suddenly should drape ladies in aniline mauve, that it should sweep in strident green through gaslit drawing rooms? Who would have guessed that sand yellow stone would fight its own earth pull, learn to wall and overhang, or that it would create its own tonal range, creased dark in shade, sullen in rain, or lit by the summer sun to honey ochre? Who would have known this place of heavy dark looms would step us straight into the world of Hockney, to the Californian blue of a swimming pool, to spring bursting green through a Yorkshire road, making its asphalt bloom a surprising magenta. And in the last two verses, I try to create something like an impressionist painting with the canal, the red tourist barge, and the people.
Thank you. Another thread running through the poems is the people connected with Bradford. Who are some of the people that you write about?
Well, I make it very clear that I'm interested in the hidden stories, the unknown people. I have that theme quite often. And someone who bridges that towards the better known people was Joe Hardcastle, an ordinary working man who was a bell ringer and who started the appeal to replace the bells in the cathedral in 1919. And it gave me such pleasure to write a sonnet to Joe. I write about the saints who are a presence in the cathedral, the great saints of the northern spiritual tradition, who I think are often sadly neglected. Cuthbert, and I never feel Cuthbert would be happy stuck in stained glass in a building, so I get him out to the mirror pool. And Hilda, very much a saint for our time, a strong, reconciling woman. And I intersperse those biblical figures, and of course there's figures from Bradford's past, like Titus Salt and Emily Bronte. And both Mary Magdalene and Emily Bronte, I write about in Ballad Meter. It's quite interesting to think of those two remarkable women together. But of course, I couldn't neglect the new young techie Bradford, the place of online creativity. And that's present in my poem, Billy Liar. I know he's a fictional character, but then there were many, many Billy Liars around in the 50s and in the 60s before they began to swing. A teenager stuck in an early 60s world of black and white. A dreamer trapped in the monochrome sludge of film. A funeral clerk. He still lives at home, which coffins him in narrow custom. In Undercliff, he tries and fails to feel a girl's warm flesh. Gored gravestones rear like spectres. He escapes in fantasies. The armies of Ambrosia march through his mind and uniform him in power. We need to throw some colour at the screen, some Asian reds and golds. We need flat water to rise in fireworks, so the night explodes in jewel fountains at the city's heart. We need to fast forward to a Bradford where even the eatery names fly into dreams. Mystic Pizza, Staunton. Push our hero to the museum where imagining swell and flicker across a blank white rectangle. We need to make him rap, stream a quirky video, slam a poem. Now he would not bottle it and flee from the London train, or even need to approach a Bradford station. The story would not end with a defeated Billy walking home at the head of a fantasy band. Now he would walk triumphant through the city of film and be followed by a Twitter feed.
I guess most of us listening tonight will know something at least of Bradford's industrial history and its legacy. Have you included those elements in the poems?
Very much. We all know, I think, that Bradford was the wool capital of the world, and its immense wealth is shown in those wonderful buildings. But of course, even in its heyday, there was a dark side. In one poem, I gave voice to a fish that was choking to death on industrial dyes. There was huge ecological damage. And the second verse of that poem gives voice to a teenager who's working in the mill. And there's quite a lot in the collection about the hard life, the cramped housing. And of course, the Bradford was part of a trade empire which did not deliver economic and social justice to the countries it occupied. In the centenary poem, which looks at what the local paper said on 25th of November 1919, yes, the paper's full of all sorts of some parochial, some very bizarre things, but no one's thinking that that was the year of the appalling Amritsar massacre in India. And out of that, slowly, a movement of non-violent protest grew, which in time would change the cityscape and the population of Bradford. Of course, economic decline is written on some of those wonderful buildings. If we ascend to Little Germany now, there is Budleigh straddling on a listed building, seeming less alive than the plumped out roses carved in stone below, a dark slit that was a letterbox gapes into vast roomed emptiness. And the poem, which is a divided place poem, goes on to talk about families struggling to feed themselves and unemployment. And those tensions were erupted in the 2001 riots, which I do write about. But I also follow that by showing how the city, for the riots was a devastating experience, came together when the English Defence League, and I hate their title, tried to sow racist division in Bradford. And people of the city came together in a We Are Bradford movement that was so important for the city's identity. And I devote a separate poem to the wonderful Women for Peace movements, where Christian, Muslim women, women of no faith, they all came together. And so that when the troublemakers burst through the interchange station, they were met by women with green ribbons singing a peace song. And certainly I see many signs of creative collaboration. I pick up the fact that Polly Maynell in those textiles has Asian silks, Yorkshire worsted together to produce something wonderful. And I see that, for instance, I use the Literature Festival as an example. For me, to participate in its final event, which is at the Cathedral, a sacred poetry event, and to participate with people of different faiths as we shared our own poetry and music and song. That was one of the most moving experiences of my writing life.
And one of the joys of living and working in Bradford is doing those things alongside people of other faiths. And you refer to that in some of your poems. Was it something that particularly interested you about Bradford?
It very much interests me, yes. And yes, in my poems, I refer to the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the Psalms. For instance, there's a poem, Laying Down the Prayer Mat. The interesting thing that when Muslims in the 20th century brought prayer mats to Bradford, they were reintroducing something that the monks in Lindisfarne had done in northern England long ago. It was also an early Christian prayer practice. And one poem I really enjoyed writing was Mary Mariam, about the mother of Jesus, who is so important to Christianity and Islam. And I juxtapose the accounts from the Gospels and the Quran, hoping to show the amazing spiritual riches of this woman in each of the accounts. And I am that poem, one woman in whom two faiths that have vilified and fought can exchange gifts. And I'd also make that to make points. I hope my collection will move and touch people who haven't got a specific creed, because we are all, as I say in a poem, we are all unwilling pilgrims. We are all on a spiritual journey. We're all sometimes a bit inept and absurd, me probably more than most people, but we are all engaged on that spiritual journey.
Thank you. The residency came about because of the Cathedral centenary in 2019. How does the collection reference that?
Well, as I said, both the Cathedral and the city had to develop different roles. And in my centenary poem, when I talk about the city, I use two things as images. I talk about City Hall, that row of kings and queens carved in stone at the front. And it's a certain version of English history. It's linked to power and it's carved in stone, it's set. And then I contrast that with the wonderful and recent creation of the Mirror Pool, which is a place of play and fun and community. And it's reflecting the sheer diversity of Bradford, different ages, different forms of dress, different cultural customs, and it's Bradford as fluid presence, made and remade. Then when I was thinking about how the cathedral's role had changed, when I spoke to the Dean, he mentioned a particular service, the consecration of the restored bells, when the guides for the day were Muslim school children who told surprising facts to elderly worshippers about their own cathedral. A rich mix of people who make Bradford joined a liturgy of gratitude and shared the child heaven of squirty cream and strawberries. A mirror pool supplied by Bradford Council that offers baptism in the joy of water. A small and far from rich cathedral offering to bless every citizen by reflecting back the God self within them.
And many of us will have been there at that event, and it was truly extraordinary. And I know that Canon Paul will remember vividly the squirty cream. Finally, we're about to enter the season of Advent, which of course leads on to Christmas. And we're probably feeling a little bit queasy about Christmas this year. So have you any poems that would remind us of a Bradford Christmas?
I have a few poems about Christmas. And there's one specifically about a Bradford Christmas, and I'll read some of it because I suddenly realised how lots of the elements of the traditional Christmas story are present in Bradford, but in a rather updated, shall we say, form. There have to be shepherds in this former hub of wool. There must be sheep. Not just that carved beast at Waterstones. Out in dark dales, we glimpse a few white blurs, soft woolly shapes, penned in by dry stone walls. No sign of shepherds. Of course, they are watching Netflix, surrounded by secular Christmas cards. People from the East have already arrived, bringing their knowledge and other precious gifts. Gold gleams in the dome of the Grand Mosque. Even old Yorkshire shops stock unfamiliar spices. The 10-year census has been returned. The City Hall computers seethe with statistics. The Home Office is sure some immigrant has slipped the net, perhaps a minor. Following a lead, an inspector bursts into an outbuilding and finds a rag and bone horse. A peanut advert appears in Broadway with a no-nonsense message. Wise men don't come bearing bruschetta. And the poem goes on, and it doesn't find Christmas in the big jolly events. It finds it in something much smaller and more personal. So can I just say that in choosing these poems, I've carefully, on the whole, not chosen poems that I've read at public events. There is a bit of duplication, but that there are other poems that I consider really strong and significant that I haven't read from on this occasion. So I hope it will encourage people to explore more poems in the collection.
Diane, thank you so very much. One of the things that poetry does is to give us a different slant on things, a different slant on life, in fact. And your poems certainly do that. So thank you very much for your insights into poetry, into Bradford, and into the Cathedral. And thank you in particular for giving us your talents and so much of your time to Bradford. It really has been a wonderful experience having you. And we now have a wonderful book. And so I know some of you, there we are, some of you have your copies already, but if you don't, it can be got through the Cathedral. Now, because it's considered non-essential retail, no idea why, you can't actually go and buy one from the Cathedral, but you can go online. In fact, you must be online. You can go online and £10 will ensure that one plops through your letterbox. And so I think Phil's putting up a link in the chat box, but it's on the Cathedral website. So I'm now going to hand over to Phil because Diane would be very happy to take questions and would love to hear the comments about her poems.
Hi, Diane.
Hello.
It's so uplifting to hear you talking so passionately about your collection. Thank you. It's been wonderful. I would like to ask you the classic question, really. How did it come about that you became a poet?
Well, when I was a child, I was scribbling poetry all the time, all in rhyme. And other people's writing has always illuminated and filled my life, whether it was huge waves of Shakespeare I absorbed very young, or whether it's someone I've got to know recently, like the poet Alice Oswald. It was wonderful. My husband, as I said, was an artist. It's wonderful living with an artist because you get to look at things so carefully. You're aware of colour and shape. And it was just exciting being in a house which was a hub of creativity with ceramics and the smell of oil paint and the kick of the wheel and things being produced. It encouraged me to write. But sadly, another experience to do with him also affected my poetry, I think, very strongly, although in a different way, because when he had a terrible stroke, I cared for him. And of course, I didn't write any poetry during that period. And after his death, when I started writing, I thought, goodness, I can still write. And I think an experience like that, it's like a huge rift in your life, like scorched earth, and it changes you and it changes your writing. And I just felt my writing became stronger after going through that. But then why a poet, you may ask, and not a novelist? Because I have written a novel. It's been translated into Italian, but not published in this country. But I do find I'm very drawn to poetry because every word tells in a poem. And also in a poem is essentially, it's a dialogue with silence, whether when you're reading it, the silence between verses and pauses, or whether it's that white page with the print blocks. It's something in the Hebrew scriptures they call white fire, black fire. And I think that idea of words really counting, but being pared down and being a dialogue with silence is very potent if you're writing about something sacred. Well, yes, that's interesting because some poems are a lot of work. What I find helps is to jot things down and to perhaps have a first draft. The first shape you have, get it down, even if you're not happy with the wording, because that first shape is important. And then your first draft, perhaps put it in a drawer and leave for a bit. Because I find if you look at things after a little while, things you suddenly think, oh, that doesn't work. I could put that. You see it with more perspective. So I think it's really useful to give yourself a bit of time. But of course, poems can be growing in your mind for years, and then you haven't quite got it together, and then suddenly you manage to. I mean, I think it's always work, that first vision you have. You're going to have to work, you're going to have to pare down, you're going to have to refine phrases generally, although just sometimes it flows, and that's a real gift. I don't know if that's any help. Can I just say I'm now writing poems for St James Piccadilly, which there's some people here for St James, which I'm very touched by. And you'll notice the joy I have in this collection, writing about the Dales. And there's one poem, Fellow Travellers, where I write about things like a harebell or a goose. And it was good with St James. I mean, with lockdown, all my plans had gone haywire. But St James has a wheat growing project called Daily Bread, and we grew wheat both in the courtyard of the church, but also in our gardens, and people grew on balconies, and I tended my own wheat. And we watched it at every stage, and I'm working with an artist and a scientist, which is absolutely wonderful, and we're exploring all sorts of themes. And I so enjoyed writing the poems about nature in Dark Angelic Mills. I've been so lucky to be able to be involved in a wonderful church and have that creative opportunity. I'm so bad at saying I have one favourite. I mentioned Alice Oswald. I think the living poet, she's absolutely wonderful. I admire Emily Dickinson. You will have gathered I rather like Blake. Songs. The huge prophetic books are rather challenging, but songs of innocence and experience, I think, are wonderful because the apparent simplicity holds so much. But I'm very open to all sorts of poets, really. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone who's come, and it's lovely, as I can't travel to Bradford, it's wonderful to see some people I know, my friends, and also people from other places like St James's. It's a great joy. Thank you so much.
Well, Diane, it's been such a joy to have you around in Bradford and around the Cathedral for all of last year, and to now have your book of poetry based here. It's just such a gift, and we're so very grateful for your hard work and for your travelling backwards and forwards from London to Bradford. Please know that you are welcome anytime, and that you are an honorary member of the Bradford community.
Well, the minute lockdown's over and I can travel, you can expect me.
that would be great. That would be great. So thank you very much for bringing your insights, your forthrightness, that different perspective. It really is a gift to us, and we have found it very hard to kind of, well, what do we do next? Having had such a successful year working with you. But we do have a photographer in residence at the moment, and that's all been a little bit constrained over the last few months, but we're hopeful that through this year we'll have somebody else bring a different slant to us.